Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This evening will be held in English, and as you know, the subject that we have selected, Israel, the Jews, and the Sunni-Shiite conflict, has turned out to be even more topical than when it was originally envisaged before the recent conflict in Gaza. This evening has been organized by the Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism at the Hebrew University, of which I have the privilege of being the head and director for the last 7 years. And before we begin, I would like to thank all the members of our small but dedicated staff, beginning with Ruchama Roth and Sarah Grosswald, for the extraordinary efforts that they put together to ensure that so many of you could come this evening and hear tonight's speakers. I would also like to make a few comments about the reasons for selecting this particular topic before I introduce the esteemed and eminent members of this panel. We are now at the beginning of the year 2009. We are 30 years on from the Iranian Revolution of 1979, one of the most dramatic and important events of the last century. We are one day after the inauguration of a new American president, an Afro-American president whose middle name is Hussein. We are just a few days after the end of a 3-week war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. And it seems to me one doesn't need to be a prophet to know that this year, 2009, may well turn out to be a very fateful year in the history of the Middle East, of Israel, of the Arab world, of the Jewish people, of America, Europe, and indeed the rest of mankind. We are obviously at a very important crossroads. And one somewhat neglected aspect of that is tonight's subject, the Sunni-Shia conflict, something which in recent years has become of increasing concern in the Arab world and Arab political discourse, where talk of the Shia resurgence, the Shia threat, the Shiite crescent has become increasingly notable. As you know, the largest, and in fact, the only fully Shiite state in the Middle East today is Iran, and Iran is in all of our minds. But in recent times, something unprecedented also happened, which others will elaborate on. For the first time, an Arab country, namely Iraq, has also come increasingly under some form of Shiite control. That too is a matter of considerable significance. I do not intend to go into, perhaps Professor Lewis may do so in his very succinct way, into the origins of the Sunni-Shiite conflict, which goes back to the days of early Islam. What I think even those of us who are not quote-unquote Orientalists, I know that's a terrible word, even those of us who do not deal with this professionally are aware that the Shias are a small minority in the larger Sunni Arab world, perhaps something like 15% altogether. And for a long time, they felt and were discriminated against and perhaps, arguably, developed something of a persecution complex. But these days may increasingly be over, as there has been a noticeable rise in the influence, the weight, and importance of Shiite communities, notably in Lebanon. And we have seen, since the Iranian Revolution, a galvanization of a peculiar kind of Shiite radicalism with a messianic edge, something which particularly needs to preoccupy us in Israel, and it's one of the reasons why we have attached to the title of this evening's proceedings the issue not only of Israel, but also of the Jews. This is something, of course, that belongs closer to my own speciality as a historian, among other things, of anti-Semitism. And in the course recently of working on a book entitled A Lethal Obsession, which will be published later this year, I came to realize that there is also a distinctive version of Islamist anti-Semitism within the Shia world, whose nuances, although we probably will not go into them here in any detail, are worthy of consideration. The fact is that anti-Semitism is not unrelated to some of the geopolitical and strategic issues that will be discussed here tonight. For some obvious reasons, which in recent years have become increasingly graphic, the connection between the demonization of the State of Israel and of Jews more generally, the link with revolutionary radicalism in the Middle East, with terrorism, and with, in particular, Iranian aspirations to establish regional hegemony. I would even suggest, and I don't intend to develop this here at this point, but I would suggest that in some ways the kind of anti-Semitism that has come out of Iran, although it is not that original and it has predecessors and harbingers in the Sunni Arab world, is a kind of Trojan horse which has enabled Iran to win over some sections, certainly of Shia communities in other parts of the Middle East, some Sunni fundamentalist radicals, and more generally to obscure its own strivings for great power status and the spread, the export of the Islamist revolution. And yet cracks have appeared, and this is the immediate, as it were, cause of our discussing this issue. Cracks have appeared in that facade which were always there. In other words, the kind of antagonism and antithesis even between Sunnis and Shias, between Iran and the Arab world, the long-standing antagonism, has shown up more recently as a result of this conflict in Gaza, as you all have heard and seen on your television screens, when we reach the point where the President of Egypt, Hosni Mubarak, is not only vilified across the Arab world, but indeed is challenged by the leader of the Lebanese Shiite Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, who calls on the Egyptian people to perhaps force open the crossings at Rafah. And in response, the Egyptian foreign minister says, if need be, our armed forces will also protect Egypt from people like you. Then we know that there is a rift, a strategic fault line, which is opening up between two rival blocs in the Arab world. And the question then becomes for Israel, What does this mean for us? We need to look at history, and we will look at history, in order to help us understand, has this happened before? What are the options available for Israel in this context? I want now to turn to our first guest for this evening, for whom the old cliche that he requires no introduction would certainly be appropriate, but it would not be the right thing to do. And I certainly intend to introduce our very distinguished and eminent professor of Near Eastern Studies, Professor Emeritus from Princeton University. When I looked up Bernard Lewis's entry on Wikipedia, it's not something I normally do, but it was quite revealing. The first thing that it said was, jump to navigation watch. And then it turned out that they were referring to the founder of a River Island retail chain, See Bernard Lewis, entrepreneur. The truth is somewhat different. Bernard Lewis is, in fact, by origin at least, an Englishman, although today he would be described probably as a British-American historian, Orientalist, there it goes again, and political commentator. He, in fact, grew up and was educated in London, as indeed, for my sins, I also was, as was Ephraim Halevi, who will be introduced later on. Bernard Lewis has written a long list of highly acclaimed books. I'll only mention a few in passing, but they do indicate the range and depth of his interests and his extraordinary authority in this field. The Arabs in history, the emergence of modern Turkey, Islam and the West, what went wrong, the clash between Islam and modernity in the Middle East, and more recently, he co-authored a book with Bunsi Ellis Churchill entitled Islam, the Religion and the People. So it's a great pleasure and really an honor to be able to ask Bernard Lewis, after 6 decades at least in this field, to come up and address us once more and give us the benefit of his wisdom. Thank you.
I was saying thank you, Mr. Chairman, for those very kind words. I appreciate them, although they will make my task a little more difficult. But as time is short, I'll get down to business straight away. I was asked to speak about Sunni and Shia, the difference between them and its significance in Middle Eastern history, both early and recent. It's a common practice to try and describe the unknown in terms of the known, and a device frequently used in the Western world to explain the Sunni-Shia division is to say, well, they are the Protestants and Catholics of Islam. To which I would say, well, which are the Protestants and which are the Catholics? The question is unanswerable because the comparison is meaningless. And the Protestant-Catholic division is an entirely different thing over entirely different issues. And apart from the fact that it was a major division involving large numbers of people, I can see no other resemblance. This is not about heresy. It is not about ecclesiastical authority. There is not, or at least there wasn't until very recently, no pope in Islam. And therefore the question of papal jurisdiction has not arisen. The difference between Sunni and Shia begins as a purely political difference, a difference over the succession to the headship of the Islamic community. Muhammad, as you will recall, unlike other founders of religions, triumphed during his lifetime. Moses was not permitted to enter the promised land. Jesus was crucified. Muhammad did not suffer either of these disagreeable fates. He conquered his promised land, and he became its ruler. And therefore, when he died, there was the immediate problem of succession. Who was to succeed him? Not as prophet, since he was the last of the prophets, but as head of the Muslim community, and therefore also at the same time ruler of the Muslim state. There was a disagreement between those who thought that he should be succeeded by members of his family, who invoked the dynastic principle. He had no son, but he had a daughter who was married to a cousin. And the suggestion was that the cousin, son-in-law, and his children were the lawful, legitimate leaders of the House of Islam. They came to be known as the Party of Ali, in Arabic, Shiite Ali. They failed. The headship of the community went the other way to a form of election, and the heads of the Islamic world after that for a very long time were various dynasties of caliphs, the term used for the heads of the community. The Shia of Ali, to give it its full title, were the opposition, and they remained for a very long time the opposition within the Islamic world. Originally, as I said, a political, dynastic opposition, but naturally, over centuries, the experience of being the disprivileged, excluded opposition group has a formative historical effect. And Shia Islam developed, shall we say, different characteristics from those of Sunni Islam, the characteristics of an excluded, disprivileged minority, even at times a majority, but I'll come back to that point. Naturally, in the course of the centuries, other differences developed between them, not just the difference over the question of the succession. They developed differences of law, differences of practice, differences of worship, and so on, but nothing resembling the differences between the major sects of Christendom. If we look at the Islamic world at the present day, it is divided between Sunni and Shia, with the Sunnis constituting the overwhelming majority in most of the Islamic world, but not all. Both are subdivided. The Sunnis are subdivided into juristic schools who recognize each other as orthodox and agree to differ. The Shia are divided rather more radically by throwing off a number of more extreme groups who became, in effect, separate religions, such as the Druze, the Alawis, the Ismailis. They are no longer part of the Shia world, though they were part of it originally. And as far as can be ascertained, they have no particular links with the Shia world at the present time. In most of the Islamic world, where the religion is overwhelmingly Sunni, the division between Sunni and Shia is not important. It's not a matter of public concern or even awareness. I remember being asked by an Egyptian lady of my acquaintance, not very well informed about her own culture and religion. She was reading something about Sunni and Shia, and she turned to me as a Middle East expert and said, "Am I a Sunni or a Shia?" She really didn't know, and I had to explain. Gaddafi, not long ago, remarked that he can't understand why we're making all this fuss about Iran. Iran is much less of a danger than Saudi Arabia. One understands what he meant, but Saudi Arabia is solidly Sunni, as is Libya, and Iran is Shiite. But that obviously was not a matter of concern to him. The Palestinians are overwhelmingly Sunni. There are Druze among them, but no Shia in the normal sense of that word. And as I said, where the population is solidly Sunni, it's not an issue. It's of no great concern. Where it matters is where the two exist side by side, or where the Shia predominate. Shia predominate in Iran. They have done since the early 16th century, when a Shia dynasty was able to seize power and turned Iran into a citadel of militant Shiism. It became the Shia world, and in a sense its identity was defined by Shiism, in contrast with the Sunni powers to the west, to the north, to the east, and to the south. And that has remained an important element of Iranian identity from the 17th century onwards, and more particularly of the ongoing struggle between the rival powers contesting the domination of the Middle East for centuries, the Shia Shahs of Iran and the Ottoman sultans to the west. These, as I said, were the rival powers contesting the region. In both cases, they had minorities of the other faith. In both cases, those minorities were suspect and persecuted. Not persecuted primarily because of religion, but rather because they were seen as enemy agents, or at least as potential enemy agents. Where the situation becomes really difficult, and that is what we are mainly concerned with at the present time, is where you have Sunni and Shia populations mixed. And that is true of a number of countries in the region. And where this becomes a particularly painful and difficult situation is where you have a situation which I can only describe by borrowing a word from Irish history, where you have a Sunni ascendancy. In Irish history, the term ascendancy is used to describe the many centuries during which Ireland, a country of which the vast majority of the population is Catholic, was nevertheless ruled by a minority of Protestants who held all the positions of power, authority, and profit. You had a similar situation in much of the Middle East, and more particularly in Iraq, where at some point, we don't know exactly when, the Shia became a majority. And it would seem that they have been a majority of the population of Iraq for many centuries. Nevertheless, under the various rulers that succeeded the caliphs, under the Ottomans, under the British, under the subsequent monarchy, under the republic, under the dictators, Iraq has been a Sunni ascendancy, where power and all the opportunities that power brings were limited exclusively, in most cases, to the Sunni minority who exercised this ascendancy over the Shia majority of the population. What kind of sentiments that engenders, I don't need to describe to you. Iraq is the outstanding case. It's not the only one. If you go south from Iraq to Kuwait, to Bahrain, to the adjoining regions of Saudi Arabia, again you have large Shiite populations, but subject to Sunni domination. In Kuwait, in Bahrain, certainly in Saudi Arabia, and so on. The ascendancy of the Sunnis was very much reinforced from the late 18th century onwards by the rise of the Wahhabi movement. Wahhabism is a particularly militant, radical form of Islam, very, very Sunni, which became the official faith of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The Wahhabis take a particularly negative of the Shiites, sometimes even insisting that they are not true Muslims at all, that they are renegades, and unless they adopt Sunni Islam, they must be subjected to the penalties which Sharia prescribes for renegades. They didn't usually take it that far, but that's the theoretical position of the Wahhabis. Now we have, since the Iranian Revolution, a new situation. As I said, Iran was a Shiite stronghold, but surrounded on every side by Sunni powers, it didn't constitute much of a threat to the Sunni world. This changed with the Iranian Revolution, which, like other revolutions, like the French and the Russian revolutions, had an enormous impact over the whole world with which they shared a common universe of discourse. One could see this palpably. The term revolution is very much used all over the Middle East. It is the only generally accepted claim to legitimacy. But mostly by revolution, they mean what might be more accurately described as a coup d'etat or a putsch. I give you the French and German terms. English happily has no equivalent. This is something different. This is a real revolution, a massive change, a shift in the entire situation of power in the country. And like the French and Russian revolutions in their day, with an enormous impact all over the world where they shared a common universe of discourse. That is to say, the Islamic world, including the Sunni Islamic world. I remember visiting on a lecture tour the religious universities in Indonesia, a solidly Sunni country, not long after the Islamic Revolution. And they had pictures of Khomeini hanging on the wall in the student dorms. This Shiite revolution from Iran has been seen as a real threat in such previously solidly Sunni countries as Pakistan, Bangladesh, Malaysia, Indonesia, and of course further to the west in the Arab world. It is particularly a threat in those countries where you have Shia populations, large Shia populations, sometimes local majority populations who have been suffering from a Sunni ascendancy for many, many centuries. That is the problem confronted now by the Saudi Arabians and their neighbors, dealing, one, with the threat from Iran, and two, with the internal threat resulting from this, from their own Shiite populations. This challenge has led to a new situation, the perception of Iranian tentacles extending westwards to Iraq, to Syria, to Lebanon, by a southern route, to Gaza. The Gazan people are solidly Sunni, and therefore the issue of Shiism is not as terrifying to them as it is, say, in Iraq. This alarm is giving rise in a number of Middle Eastern governments to a new assessment of the situation and of their options. And here I would remind you of what happened not so long ago when Sadat, the president of Egypt, decided that he would seek peace with Israel. He did not seek peace with Israel because he was suddenly convinced of the merits of the Zionist case. No. What persuaded Sadat to seek peace with Israel was the awareness that Egypt was in the process of becoming a Soviet colony. The Soviet presence was already overwhelming in the early 70s. The discontent among Egyptians with that presence was palpable. I can give you examples of it from my own experience. And he came to the conclusion that on the best estimate of Israel's power and on the worst estimate of Israel's intentions, Israel was less of a danger than the Soviet Union and might even be some help. That was what led Sadat to seek peace. And I see a possibility, I will not put it more strongly than that, I see a possibility that some other previously hostile Sunni rulers may also see in Israel a potential ally in dealing with this new, really dangerous threat. The events of the year 2006 are a palpable example of this, the disappointment of the Arab states when the Israelis did not do the job expected of them. I think was very clear and very obvious. And I think we may see similar attitudes at the present time. One other point, a question was raised about attitudes to Jews. Generally speaking, the attitude of the Shia rulers of Iran towards Jews was very much more negative than that of Sunni rulers in the Ottoman Empire in Egypt or elsewhere as far west as Morocco. Their position was in many ways far worse off. They were treated as ritually impure, something which probably comes from before Islam, from the Indo-Aryan notion of untouchability. And najis, ritual impurity, was a major problem which made life very difficult for Jews under Iranian rule. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bernard, for such a wide-ranging panoramic view of this Sunni-Shia divide over the centuries. At the end of your remarks, I suddenly recalled something you had written in a book called The Jews of Islam many years ago, in comparing the situation of the Jews in Persia with that of the Jews in the Ottoman Empire. And I'm quoting from memory, but it seems to me that you said something like, the situation of the Jews in the Ottoman Empire was like paradise compared to that of the Jews of Persia, certainly after the 16th century, after the Shiite takeover of Iran. Our second speaker, whom it's my privilege to introduce, is Ephraim Halevi. And I must confess that when I also went to the Wikipedia to check on what was written there, I received the same response: jump for navigation search, but nothing further, except some details which, one of which at least certainly intrigued me personally, because I had never realized that indeed in London, before you came to Israel in 1948, exactly at the time more or less when the state emerged, that you had gone to a Jewish Orthodox school. So obviously they trained you well. As I'm sure that all of you in this room know, Ephraim Halevi served for many, many years in the Mossad, which in his own brief CV, which he sent to me, appears in inverted commas. I'm not quite sure what that means, whether the Mossad is even more shadowy than we would assume, but he has had a spectacular career, moving up from division chief to becoming the head of the Mossad in the years between 1998 to 2002. Before then, among his other roles, he was Israel ambassador to the European Union in Brussels. And since retiring from government service, he has taken over, among other things, the Shasa Center for Strategic Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and published a book in English, appropriately entitled Man in the Shadows, Inside the Middle East Crisis, with a man who led the Mossad. Well, I'm very pleased to confirm this evening that Mr. Ephraim Halevi has emerged from the shadows, and very much look forward to his assessment of the geopolitics and other aspects of this problem as he saw it from his own vantage point in the years of his service.
Good evening. It's a singular honor for me to be here this evening and to be sharing a podium with Professor Bernard Lewis, who is the teacher of probably all of us here in this audience and elsewhere who have been involved in the affairs of this part of the world over more than half a century. In the year 1948, when Israel came into being, it fought its war of independence. It fought its war of independence against the Arab Sunnites in the Middle East, the Arab states which surrounded it, and the indigenous population here who were Sunnites. This was a united Sunnite world against Israel. And at the end of that war, nobody ever dreamt that there could be within the foreseeable future any possibility of a rapprochement, because immediately after the war, the Arab states made it clear that there was no intention on their part to proceed with a peace process with Israel, that they would have an armistice agreement with us, and that they would await for a better time to see whether they could do what they had failed to do in 1948. In the 50s, in the first years of the State of Israel, the Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, in his vision of what Israel might be able to do to improve its strategic position in the region, in the sea of enmity which surrounded it, created and fostered and promoted the idea of what he called the alliance of the periphery, an alliance between Israel and states which were not in the heartland of the Middle East from our point of view, but which could be natural allies of ours with common interests, partial or more than partial, depending on what their particular position would be, and that this alliance, this periphery alliance, could fashion into something more extensive, which would not only include defense affairs, but economics and the rest. And he reached out initially to two countries, one a Sunnite country, Turkey, but is still to some extent a secular Sunnite country, and he reached out to Iran. At the time, this was a very secret alliance. It was a secret alliance because the very fact that Arab states or Sunnite states or Shiite states would do anything together with Israel was very dangerous from their point of view and was fraught with jeopardy. And I recall that in 1956, 53 years ago, when I was president of the National Union of Israeli Students, I traveled to several international conferences representing Israel at the height of the Cold War, on the eve of the Sinai campaign and on the eve of the events in Poznan and the uprising in Budapest, and attended a conference among other places in a place called Ceylon at the time, now Sri Lanka, and tried to fly back to Israel through Bombay, where we had a consulate, but missed my plane, which was an Air France bi-weekly flight, and therefore was marooned in India without any possibility of continuing. And when I went to the Israeli consul there and asked what I could do, he said to me that since I was not a diplomat of the Israeli Foreign Service, he didn't think he had to tell me what to do, and I could decide on my own what I could do. So what I did was I looked at the possibilities of flights, and I saw Tehran on the map, and I thought to myself, since I knew there were weekly flights from Tehran to Tel Aviv, I would fly to Karachi, and from there take a plane, a Pakistani plane, to Tehran, and from there take a plane to Israel, not knowing that when I got into Karachi, the first thing that was done at the border was that my passport was confiscated, and I was more or less detained, and then put on a plane to Tehran, a small two-engined plane with 9 stops on the way. And when we reached Tehran, I was taken off the plane and put into a detention cell and told I should wait there until such time as the authorities there would decide what to do with me. This was a predicament that I did not expect. I had no previous experience in these affairs, and I waited for several hours until somebody approached the door of my cell and opened the door and walked in and sat across me, looked at me, gave me his hand, shook my hand, and said in Hebrew, "Ma shlomcha, how are you?" To which I said, "Mitsuyan, excellent." I didn't know whether to take him bona fide or not, since I had read a few spy novels in the past. And after a short conversation, it was obvious to me that I was talking to a genuine Israeli. And after 10 minutes, he said to me, "Do you have $50? And I said, "Sure, I have a $50 note." He said, "Give me a $50 note. That's what it will cost you." And he took the $50 note, and he went away, and he came back, and he brought back my passport to me, and he gave it to me, and he said, "I've arranged for you to have a flight in a few hours' time, and you will fly from Tehran to Tel Aviv." And that was my first meeting with Yaakov Nimrodi, and it was also my first brush with the Mossad. The relationship between Israel and Iran flowered into something much more extensive, as I said, than simply a defense and an intelligence link. It became a very important element of Israel's economy. We not only bought oil from Iran, we constructed, in the years to come, a very, very significant pipeline from Eilat to Ashkelon, which, by the way, operates today, but in a different direction. It goes from Ashkelon to Eilat, for obvious reasons. and we supply oil to certain countries east of us, rather than being a recipient from oil which was then east of us. But nevertheless, we developed a very, very large relationship with Iran, which was a Shiite country, but I believe, at the danger of being called out by Bernard, I would say it was more a secular Shiite rather than a religious Shiite regime of the Shah. And we also added to this two other countries. One was Ethiopia, which was a Christian country at the time, led by Emperor Haile Selassie. And we had a latent partner to this, a Sunnite partner, who for many years also maintained a big veil of secrecy over themselves, and has afterwards came into the limelight, came out of the shadows, and that was Morocco. So suddenly we had this periphery which stretched from the Atlantic till the Persian Gulf, and it looked a very, very promising alliance. We thought it was a very good alliance. We could rely upon it for all intents and purposes. However, two things happened in the 70s, or three things happened in the 70s. The one was, as you probably know, that we had the Yom Kippur War, which was a war of various aspects to it. But amongst other things, the Yom Kippur War created probably the greatest divide we had with some of the non-aligned parts of the world. And it created a crisis, a very serious crisis, with some of our colleagues and members of the periphery. And had not we reached the point where Sadat decided, as Bernard said, to change course and to seek an accommodation with us, we would have been in very bad shape. But as you know, in 1977, the results of an effort which had been quite intensive in the years before that, there was the initiative, the Sadat visit to Jerusalem. We had the peace treaty with Egypt. We felt we were really riding high. We had a peace treaty on the one hand, and we had a periphery on the other hand, and then came Khomeini and the revolution. And that, of course, changed everything. It changed everything because not only did we lose Iran, but Iran became our implacable enemy. And as we looked further for various means of dealing with the issues in the region, we realized that after the initial breakthrough of Egypt, we would not have a similar event within the years to come, because Egypt immediately was ostracized in the Arab world. Actually, it was more or less ostracized in the Arab League for 10 years, if you remember. And we realized that if on the one hand we had just Egypt next to us, so we didn't have the periphery on the other hand, where would we go in terms of the region? I'm not talking about the international aspect of it all. And we were lucky or unlucky, whichever the case may be, to have to contemplate what happened then in the 80s, which was the 8-year war between Iraq and Iran. And the basic problem was for us, with whom should we side? Should we side with the Sunnites, or should we side with the Shiites? And in the Israel defense establishment, there was a very, very serious debate about this, whether we should be on the one side or on the other side. However, when we ultimately reached the final bottom line of this debate, we looked around, neither one side or the other side wanted us at all. Neither the Shiites wanted us to help them, nor the Shiites wanted us to help them. So the debate, in effect, was a moribund debate. But there was one event which did occur, which gave us an opportunity, a possibility, maybe to turn things around in a different way. And that was when, after the Iranians were involved in several aspects of the hostages who had been taken in Lebanon, American hostages and other hostages, and after we also lost our pilot, Ron Arad, in an operation in the north, in Lebanon, the question arose whether we could find an avenue to Iran and whether we could be useful in recreating some of what we had lost in the past by arranging for a very elaborate scheme in which Israel and the United States would cooperate secretly to give Iran weaponry, especially in the field of anti-aircraft capabilities, which would then be appreciated by Iran and maybe open the road to a possible renaissance of one kind or another of our relationship with Iran. Well, this didn't work for three reasons. A, it didn't work because at the time that the United States was trying to help Iran, it was also helping Iraq in a very, very definitive way, and the Iranians knew this, and therefore they didn't believe that the American effort was a genuine one, and I'm not sure it was. This is what was called, by the way, Iran-Gate, if you remember, the famous Iran-Gate. Secondly, because the equipment which we supplied the Iranians, they claimed was faulty equipment. I'm not sure it was, but between you and us this evening, and please don't quote me, I'm not sure it wasn't. And the third reason was that in the ultimate, the struggle, the fight between Iraq and Iran in those days was of such an important consequence that the idea that a couple of Hawk missile batteries would change the course of history was probably far-fetched. So we found ourselves, in the end, on the minus side, on the debit side of both sides in this conflict, and the only thing we could hope for was that the conflict would continue as long as possible, because we thought, and I think rightly so, that the longer the war continued between Iran and Iraq, it would be for our benefit in very other aspects, which I would like to mention this evening, and which maybe Dora would like to mention afterwards. I would like to end by saying this. One of the things that I would like to conclude out of all this is, and I think that maybe some things that Dora will say will bear it out, in the end was that our attempt to engineer the Arab world, whatever configuration it is, in such a way that we would be able to use those divisions in a way which would permanently be to our benefit was, I think, beyond our capacity. We were able to do three things. One was to break the unity in the Arab world, to destroy Arab unity, to destroy the political impetus and the political value of the Arab League and what it represents. And in these days that we're talking this evening, you've seen this reached almost, I think, its ultimate conclusion, when a man like Amr Moussa says in the middle of the recent Gaza war that the Arab League is in a state of total turmoil and chaos, and I think it is. And I think this is probably an achievement, a strategic achievement, but that we could harness the Shiites and the Sunnites, and that we could sort of handle it in such a way and calibrate it in such a way that would be to our benefit, I think is slightly beyond our capability. It's even beyond the capability of the United States of America, which is also a power in the Middle East alongside Israel. So did I say something wrong? Oh. So in conclusion, this round of the first round, I'd like to say this. I think we had a good innings, if I can say that, in these issues. I think we did quite well as things went. And I think now maybe we have to see where we go from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ephraim. Now, for the first time, you will actually hear some American accented English. I didn't know that that was so popular here, but there we are. Our third distinguished panelist is Ambassador Dr. Dora Gold, who wears several hats. He's currently president of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Most of you may recall that he was also, in the years 1997 to 1999, the permanent representative of Israel to the United Nations. He served as a foreign policy advisor to former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and he also served as an advisor to Ariel Sharon. He has considerable experience in negotiations in the Middle East through the 1990s and since the beginning of this century. He's also, dare I say it, an Orientalist, and has authored a number of important books which are relevant to our discussions this evening. I would like to single out in particular Hatred's Kingdom, how Saudi Arabia supports the new global terrorism, from 2003. The very aptly titled, I think, Tower of Babel, how the United Nations has fueled global chaos. I wonder if the present Secretary General has read this book. He might be well advised to consider it. And indeed. And more recently, in 2007, The Fight for Jerusalem, Radical Islam, the West, and the Future of the Holy City. So I'm very pleased to invite Dora Gold to speak about more recent developments.
When you mentioned my book, Hatred's Kingdom, what immediately came to mind was an old development. It was when a Wahhabi army in 1802 went into Ottoman Iraq and slaughtered 5,000 Shiites, claiming they were infidels and didn't deserve to live. That was my first serious introduction to the Shiite-Sunni conflict in the little corner of Middle East studies that I was analyzing. Tonight's event is called Israel, the Jews, and the Sunni-Shiite Conflict, which suggested to me a kind of question of where should we put our chips, with the Sunnis or with the Shiites? And there's a temptation, perhaps when you're confronted with this subject, to try and look into some of the subjects that Professor Lewis raised, such as the fact that a Jew touching an apple or any kind of food item gives it ritual impurity in Shiite Islam, but not in Sunni Islam. But is that how we should decide, on that basis, what our alliances should be in the Middle East? I tend to doubt it. In fact, Israel has confronted this question of where to put its chips in the conflict on repeated occasions, and Ephraim certainly surveyed a number of them. I'll go back a little bit into the history to go into the present very quickly. The fact of the matter is, when Israel has been confronted with this question of where its loyalties should be in this huge Middle Eastern question, it's really decided the issue on the basis of strategic circumstances and strategic interests, and not, how a Shiite mosque is different from a Sunni mosque, or whatever the particulars are of their religious practices. I think that one of the first moments where we confronted this question was in the First Lebanon War back in 1982. Because as you remember, the First Lebanon War involved Israel confronting a Sunni-led bloc in Lebanon and supporting the Lebanese Front, which at that time was mostly the Christian Phalangist armies and some allies they had. But when Israel went into Lebanon, it was fighting the PLO, which had allied itself with the Sunnis and the Druze, and the Shiites celebrated our arrival. In fact, many people in our Ministry of Defense at the time were thinking about maybe we had an opportunity to create an alliance with the Shia of southern Lebanon against the PLO Sunni Druze bloc, which was our adversary at the time. Well, the idea of the alliance and working with Amal didn't quite work out, because that kind of moderate direction and that direction in the Shia community in southern Lebanon, which embraced Israel's arrival and Israel's defeat of the PLO, was quickly replaced because of the activities of revolutionary Iran, which even before the 1982 war decided to dispatch revolutionary guards to the Bekaa, to the area of Baalbek, and to create a new Shiite party that would compete with Amal, the older Shiite party, and that new party eventually became Hezbollah. And while the Shiites initially embraced us, once revolutionary Iran put down its stakes in Lebanon and gave money, weaponry, training, and a military backing of a Revolutionary Guard presence, the Shiite loyalties in Lebanon quickly shifted, and the Shiites became our primary adversaries in a guerrilla war. So from being potentially aligned with the Shiites at the beginning of the war, we were fighting the Shiites for the next decade or more. Ephraim Halevi also mentioned the Iran-Iraq war, which confronted us with this same dilemma. Do we go with the Shiites or do we go with the Sunnis? And the Sunnis were represented at that time by Saddam Hussein. And of course, we had revolutionary Iran under Ayatollah Khomeini, so which devil do you take? Now, as Ephraim Halevi said, there was a real debate. Questions came up. Saddam wanted to put up a pipeline carrying Iraqi oil to Aqaba. And there was some talk that he wanted reassurances that Israel wouldn't bomb the pipeline. So that's a decision, albeit somewhat indirect, to go with the Sunnis. And of course, Ephraim mentioned the Iran-Contra Affair, which of course included the question of selling weapons to Iran, which is what Iran wanted in trade for hostages, arms for hostages. But it also involved an evaluation of whether the successors of Khomeini, in particular Rafsanjani, could become a potential partner with Israel. Big mistake. Rafsanjani, of course, was one of the people who promoted some of the worst terrorist attacks in the 1990s, from Argentina to Khobar Towers. So, in any event, this choice was a choice we had to make. The confrontation had become an armed militant confrontation between the Sunni world and the Shiite world. And now we're facing, again, the same choice. And the question is, how are the present circumstances different from those previous instances that we coped with? Right after 9/11, we had no thoughts about trying to work with the Iranians. The Iranians have been going from bad to worse. But we also had a serious Sunni problem, because what 9/11 revealed were that the sons of those Wahhabis who went into Karbala in 1802 had gone into the World Trade Center. Most of the hijackers in 9/11 were Saudis, surprisingly to many people who never thought of Saudi Arabia as a state supporting terrorism like Libya or Syria. And from our perspective here, back in the year 2003, if you wanted to find out who was the primary funder of Hamas, and this is at the time when we have buses blowing up with suicide bombers in the heart of Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and elsewhere, the primary funder of Hamas in 2003 was Saudi Arabia. Maybe 50%, maybe 70% of the Hamas budget came from Saudi Arabia. So if we're forced to make a choice between Saudi Arabia, the empire of Wahhabism, and revolutionary Iran, there was no real choice to make. Well, some things have changed since then, and we should be aware of them. In 2005, a new president was elected in Iran. You might remember that the Iranian leadership is shared by the supreme leader, who is really supreme, and that's today Ali Khamenei, and the president of Iran. We had gone through two presidents, Rafsanjani, who was a smart pragmatist, who some people mistakenly called a moderate, which he wasn't, and Khatami, who in the end turned out to be extremely weak in comparison to the strength of Ali Khamenei. Khatami is voted out, is no longer running for office in 2005, and the mayor of Iran, mayor of Tehran, is elected, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. And his election is described by people who monitor Iran better than I do as the second Iranian revolution. And there's a sense that the ideological vigor of the Iranian Revolution from 1979 is being renewed. That's the first big change that's occurring in comparison to the past. Second of all, in 2002, the Iranian opposition reveals to the world that Iran has been running, for at least a decade, a clandestine nuclear program. And we suddenly hear about places like Natanz and Isfahan, where the Natanz is the place where the uranium enrichment is occurring, and in Isfahan is the uranium conversion. And another place called Arak, where a heavy water reactor is being built. And it becomes clear as the confrontation between the West and Iran gets more clarified that Iran does not need nuclear energy, it needs nuclear weapons. So now we have a renewed Iranian revolution, a second Iranian revolution. We now have an Iran seeking to obtain nuclear weapons. And we have a president of Iran who doesn't talk about a dialogue of civilizations like Khatami, but he talks about wiping Israel off the map. And he doesn't say it once, he says it repeatedly. And he adds some more elements to it to give one a sense that the intentions on the Iranian side are looking more genocidal than they are just rhetorical. Now, what was remarkable this time, this round, in this confrontation between the Sunni world and the Shia and Shia Iran, are the reactions of the Arab states. The Arab states were aligned with Iraq, somewhat begrudgingly, back in the Iran-Iraq War. But now we have these incredible statements. King Abdullah of Jordan talking about a Shiite crescent beginning in Iran, stretching across a Shia-dominated Iraq, through Alawite Syria, and the Alawites had some kind of semi-recognition as being part of the Shia world, even if Professor Lewis would doubt their having much common ground, and of course arriving into Lebanon under Hezbollah. So all of a sudden the Arab Sunnis are talking about Shiite encirclement with the shifting balance of power. President Mubarak begins making comments about the loyalty of Shiites to Iran in the Arab world, not loyal to their Arab Sunni leaders. And then, after our disengagement from Gaza and Iran's decision to sort of take over sponsorship of the Hamas movement, we have President Mubarak saying that on his northern border, he has a shared border with Iran. So the geostrategic awareness of the Sunni Arab bloc to the Iranian problem seems far more pronounced today than in the past. Now, in the aftermath of both wars, the 2006 Second Lebanon War and our recent war in Gaza, we see the polarization between the Sunni bloc and Shiite Iran becoming stronger, with, of course, certain Arab states joining this bloc. Syria's been with Shiite Iran going back to the beginning of the Iran-Iraq War. That's not a new alignment. But all of a sudden, Qatar, who was our big friend in the Arab world in the 1990s, Qatar is sponsoring a conference for rehabilitation of the Gaza Strip. And who do they invite? And who stays away? Well, they invite the president of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, to Qatar. The Egyptians, the Jordanians stay away from the Qatari conference. Unfortunately, the new rehabilitated post-Saddam Iraq attends the Qatari conference. And we see big shifts in the Arab world about this question of who are you with on the issue of Gaza. The Egyptians, on their part, invite the Jordanians to Sharm el-Sheikh with the leaders of the European states. So you have Europe backing Egypt and Jordan on programs for Gaza rehabilitation, which they want to keep out of the hands of Hamas, on the one hand, and you have Qatar, on the other hand, trying to form this bloc with Iran, Syria, unfortunately, as I say again, Iraq, and a few other states. They all get together in Kuwait, but the fundamental division has been established. We are now challenged about how we confront this situation. The fact that the Shia-Sunni split is, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say this, the predominant conflict in the Middle East today, much more than our conflict, which we are very absorbed with, but when push comes to shove, that is the big conflict, and this is a much smaller drama, we're still confronted about what to do. Some of the thinking, in terms of practical policy, has been that we have to exploit, is maybe not the right word, but we have to manage this situation and develop an alliance with the Sunni bloc against this new renewed Shiite Iranian threat. And one of the approaches, for example, put forward was our idea of going to the Annapolis Peace Conference back in 2007, so that we form the basis of a political dialogue, and that allows the United States to form a firmer bloc against Iranian expansionism. I had, frankly, several problems with that as a practical policy. I never understood why our political dialogue with the Palestinians or with any other Arab states is a prerequisite for Saudi Arabia to defend itself from Iran. What we do or not do in the peace process should be based on the merits of that peace dialogue if we have a peace partner with the Palestinians or anybody else. But certainly Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are going to have to defend themselves and deal with the Iranian problem regardless of what we do in our side of the Middle East. But nonetheless, some people envisioned at Annapolis a linkage between the two. And I think that linkage is mistaken. Now, I'm the last person who should necessarily take into account how an Annapolis process will affect the internal security of our Sunni Arab neighbors. It's their problem, it's not my problem. But I was struck, if we had gone ahead and made great strides in the peace process and actually worked out something, would full normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia serve the interests of the internal stability of Saudi Arabia? Or would that put the Saudis in an awkward position in the face of Iranian propaganda against them? It's something to think about. Now, in fact, what we discovered is that some of our attempts to move elements of our relations with the Palestinians forward can have the exact opposite results of what we're planning. Many in Washington over the last number of years, and especially today, say we have to deny the Palestinian card from Ahmadinejad. Therefore, it's important for Israel to make new concessions, to come up with new forthcoming proposals, even if nothing comes out of it at this point in time. And I'm certain that when Israel offered to unilaterally disengage from the Gaza Strip, someone thought that that would serve that interest. It would make it much more difficult for Iran to wage a propaganda war on behalf of the Palestinians, because here Israel unilaterally pulled out. And there's a logic to that one could understand. But ironically, the whole thing backfired. And I don't want to get into the whole question of disengagement, yes, no, that's a whole debate for another time and another place. But what essentially happened was that rather than creating a political initiative that denied Ahmadinejad the Palestinian card, what we ended up creating was an Iranian base next to southern Israel and next to northern Sinai. Instead of weakening Iran strategically, as some people thought it might, we actually strengthened Iran. Of course, this is said with, like a Monday morning quarterback after the event has occurred. But it's something to take into account as we do policy planning in the future. What sometimes seems to service interest A can end up servicing the exact opposite interest. And that's what I think happened in the case of Gaza. So we have this Shiite-Sunni conflict. We have the Sunni Arab states very concerned about any aspect of Iranian power in this part of the Middle East. We even have Sunni Arab leaders grumbling, why didn't Israel finish off Hezbollah? And today, grumbling, why didn't Israel finish off Hamas? So that is the situation we have to work with, and what do we do practically what policy choices should we make? And I'm just going to suggest one. I believe that in order to coordinate with countries that have been your adversary in the past, and may have an adversarial relationship with you at present, the last thing we should do is have a big international conference. We can talk to virtually any country in the Arab world. We can communicate with them. The communication on how to jointly handle the Iranian problem should be left to discrete channels. We have a lot to talk about. We have a lot we can do together. But I don't think we have to do these kinds of large ceremonial events that get you a good editorial in the Washington Post for a day, but don't get you much further than that. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Dora Gold, for bringing us up to date to some of the more practical and sharply pointed challenges that Israel faces and the dilemmas. We're now going into a second round, a shorter second round, where some of the points that have been elaborated by each of our speakers can be addressed according to the inclinations of each of our panelists. I wanted to turn, firstly, if I may, to Professor Lewis, and to ask you, leading on from the conclusion we just heard, given the fact that some Arab Sunni states have indeed expressed, whether discreetly or semi-publicly, their regrets at the fact that Israel, so to speak, did not do their dirty work for them by finishing off or, in effect, paralyzing or dismantling what are, in their eyes, Iranian proxies. Do you think that it would be wise, particularly with regard to Egypt, where things are more obviously polarized, to attempt to take this any further? Do you see any precedents, for instance, looking back at some of the earlier episodes, going back to Sadat, after all, who broke with the rest of the Arab world at the time to make his peace treaty with Israel? Do you see anything that we could do in Israel, or perhaps the United States could do, which would indeed move the Arab Sunni bloc of so-called moderate states, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and strengthen it? Can we work with them? Are we into a new era? Are we at the beginning of a new era where for the first time in 60 years of history, whether you see the opportunity that Israel could actually develop a coalition, for the first time be part of a Middle Eastern coalition or not, and where are the pitfalls and the problems?
Yes, obviously there are possibilities there, but I think the problem one has to bear in mind is that most of the governments of the various countries of the Middle East are extremely unpopular at home. They are repressive governments depending on constraint rather than on loyalty for their survival. There are some that depend on loyalty, but mostly do not. And that has a direct relevance to our problem. It has been remarked that the governments of the Arab world, the countries of the Arab world, from the point of view of American policy, fall into two groups. Governments with pro-American, countries with pro-American governments and therefore anti-American populations, and countries with anti-American governments and therefore pro-American populations. There is a lot of truth in that. The governments are repressive and for the most part disliked, if not detested. And therefore, a government which is pro-American, and for the same reason in favor of peace with Israel, will bring that kind of policy into disrepute merely by embracing it. And this is something we have to bear in mind in dealing with this region. And this brings me to the other aspect of the thing, and that is we have to consider the possibilities of change on the other side. And here I'm speaking more particularly of Iran. There is ample evidence of various kinds that the present regime has become extremely unpopular in Iran, and that the Iranians are just waiting for an opportunity to rid themselves of this repressive and tyrannical regime. Thanks to the wonders of modern communication, it is now possible to talk to people, even in countries like Iran, and get direct first-hand accounts of what is going on and how people feel. I have been told, for example, again and again and again, that the 1 hour a day Persian language news program from Israel is the most widely listened to and the most respected all over Iran. It is the one that they trust and believe. That, I think, tells us something. A good example, as in most Middle Eastern countries, is the political joke, which in countries under repressive regimes is the only form of political comment that has any measure of authenticity. A story is told of two Iranians chatting, lamenting the awful situation in their country. This is bad and that's worse, and this is terrible and that's awful. And finally one of them says, what we really need is to bring Osama bin Laden to this country. And the other one says in horror, what, are you crazy? And he said, no, then the Americans would come. Now, as I say, these are Iranian jokes from inside Iran, and I think that tells us something. Now, we could do, by we, I mean both the Western world in general and Israel in particular, we could do very much more than we are doing by way of, I'm trying to think of the appropriate word in English, but I can't, so I'll use the word hasbara. Do far more by way of hasbara in addressing the people of Iran in particular, and also the people of other countries in the region. And traveling around, talking to people and so on, I have found a measure of even goodwill is not too strong an expression for people, among people towards Israel, which is really amazing. You see occasional public expressions of it. A man like Vidal al-Alusi, an Iraqi politician, it brought him great trouble and danger, but he still persists in this policy. And he's not alone. There are others like him. There are people now in Middle Eastern countries who are willing to say, in strictly private conversation, that they see the benefits that Israel has brought to the region. The fact that they can now, if they are in reach, they can watch on television the really free debate of a free society. And I remember years ago in Jordan, watching Israeli television, an Arab boy, must have been about 12 or 13 years old. His wrist had been broken in a demonstration by an Israeli soldier or policeman. And he appeared next day with his wrist bandaged on Israeli television, denouncing Israeli brutality. And watching this in Jordan, it was watched with wonderment and admiration by the Jordanians. There was an Iraqi there. This was when Saddam was still in power. There was an Iraqi there, and he exclaimed, I would gladly let Saddam Hussein break both my arms and both my legs if he would let me talk like that on Iraqi television. These things are still very limited, and their effect is very limited. But they are portents, and I think that is something that we should bear in mind. And by that I mean, in particular, not ally ourselves with those that are regarded as the enemies of freedom in the region.
Thank you. I would like to ask Ephraim Halevi and also Dora Gold. With regard to the reference that was made earlier to the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, the different schools of thought in Israel itself, which way do we go, between the devil in the deep blue sea. I wonder, what are the criteria, thinking also from the standpoint of today, by which Israel should determine such a question where you have choices such as those strategic choices that appeared in the 1980s, that appear in different circumstances today, where clearly one sees the limitations of the classic theory of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I know, and you probably know this intimately from the inside, there were disagreements at the highest level within Israel about the question of Iran in the late 1980s, early 90s, whether Saddam was more dangerous, which I believe was Yitzhak Rabin's view, but I'm not sure about that, and that Yossi Beilin, of all people, took a very different view about that, and that even though there might be a short-term interest for Israel to encourage one particular power, if there are good reasons on other grounds, whatever they may be, not necessarily strategic, one should not treat that country as a potential ally. And I wonder from your own practical experiences whether both of you have any specific counsel or thoughts about the current situation from that standpoint. What are the criteria whereby Israel can navigate within these turbulent waters of Middle Eastern politics?
I'm a pragmatist, and I don't want to say that there are fixed rules on this matter because a lot depends on circumstances at the time. But I would like to make the following comment in reply to what you asked, and also to say something in relation to what Dora said and even what Bernard said. I think we have to recognize that ultimately, if we want to reach a situation in which we could live or hope to live in peace in this part of the world, the major partner for this is the immediate world surrounding us, and this immediate world is the Sunnite world. And when we reached out in the 50s to the Iranians, we did it out of necessity and out of the impossibility of finding a suitable partner or a suitable ally in the Sunnite world. Once there is a viable partner in the Sunnite world, I think this has to take precedence over everything else. But there is one other point which I think has to be said, and that is something which I think emerges from what Bernard said this evening, and I think some of the experience that which we have encountered. I think that the Sunnite-Shiite divide is a very, very profound and deep divide. And I don't really believe that there is a possibility to reach a position or a situation where there will be a really genuine, long-term Sunnite-Shiite alliance of sorts. There might be tactical understandings. There might be tactical agreements for mutual aid. But I do not think that, for instance, one can say, just to take one example, that the Hamas, the Sunnite Hamas in the Gaza Strip are an Iranian satellite or Iranian pawn. This, I think, is a statement which makes it too easy for us. It's a very important, maybe, statement, Hasbara-wise, as you say. But if we look at it in depth, the divide between the Sunnites and the Shiites will not permit that ultimately a Sunnite entity will become really integrated into a Shiite scheme of things. And by the way, there are many leaders amongst the Hamas today who have made it clear in statements of the last couple of years that the alliance they have with Iran is an alliance which gives them support, money, weaponry, training, you name it. But they do not consider themselves a satellite of Iran, and there are deep divides between them and the Iranians. The same, by the way, goes to the Syrians. especially the Alawite minority, but also the Sunnite majority in Syria, they are not Iranian pawns. They're doing all this, they're doing out of a necessity that they believe is a strategic necessity of the moment. But ultimately, it is not possible to craft a lasting Sunnite, Shiite scheme of things. That's what I believe. And even this particular conference which now took place in Doha, which was the, shall we say, the conference of the opposition, if you look who came there, if you look at the host, yes, the host is a Sunnite host. Well, Qatar is a country which has, I think, a population of 600, 700, 800,000 people, of which only a quarter are the indigenous population of Qatar. It's 200,000 Sunnites, that's all. It's a very powerful country. It's a very capable country. They have created Al Jazeera. They have oil. They have gas. They have folie de grandeur, as the Frenchman says. But look at it in proportion. And I don't believe even the Qataris see the way they have aligned themselves at the moment more than just a tactical move on their part for a variety of reasons, for which they play host to the Hamas, and they play host to a whole motley of opposition people, because they believe that by so doing they enhance their role of playing all kinds of political games in the Middle East of one kind or another, whether it's in Jordan one day, or it's on the Israeli-Palestinian issue on the second day, or it's on the divide with the Saudis on the other day. I mean, the hatred between the Qataris and the Saudis, both Sunnites, by the way, is phenomenal. But look at Saudi Arabia with, what's the population of Saudi Arabia, Dori? 20 million? 20 million Sunnites, or maybe not all Sunnites. There's a Shiite minority there. And 200,000 Qataris? But yes, they like to stand up to the Saudis and say, you know, we snub their nose. But they also know the limits of what they can do and what they cannot do. So I think it's always important to realize this. And my feeling is, and it'd be very important for me, I think, and for all of us to hear what Bernard has to say about this, that in the final analysis, it's like fire and water. The two cannot ultimately go together for any length of time.
Look, there's a big problem in developing partnerships with countries that are not real partners. Let's just take this.
Not even real countries.
Right. Tribes with flags. Churchill one time spoke about this region. But let me be more specific. Let's take Saudi Arabia. I wrote a scathing book against Saudi Arabia in 2003 because the overwhelming evidence was that Saudi Arabia was spreading money and ideological poison throughout the Muslim world, causing a great deal of the radicalization that we have seen over the last number of years, militancy, and even funding al-Qaeda. The Saudis have gone through some kind of inner changes. I don't know how complete they are. For example, pardon?
They must have read your book.
Yeah, they translated it. But no, I think the United States government has been putting a lot of pressure on the Saudis, and I think also they, since 2003, have been experiencing the blowback of their support for al-Qaeda, because they had al-Qaeda cells in Saudi Arabia.
9/11.
But 9/11 was in New York and Washington. But in 2003, it hit Riyadh. So the point is, they began to understand that they had created their own Frankenstein monster. And what you begin to see, for example, is the partnership between Saudi Arabia and the Muslim Brotherhood falling apart. Back in the days of Abdel Nasser, when Nasser was killing off members of the Brotherhood or putting them in prison, smart Egyptians who were members of the Brotherhood went to Saudi Arabia to get jobs, teaching in the universities. The same was true of members of the Brotherhood from Jordan and from Syria. So that Saudi Arabia was hosting the Muslim Brotherhood. Then it was sending members of the Muslim Brotherhood abroad, supporting its global charities. But all of a sudden, Prince Nayef, the interior minister, gives a speech a few years ago saying it was a strategic error to partner with the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, that has implications for us, because we all know that Hamas is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. So that helps explain the beginnings of the divorce between the Saudis and Hamas going back to maybe 2003, 2004. But at the same time, while we see some of these positive trends and introspection in Saudi Arabia, the U.S. Department of the Treasury at the end of 2006 puts out a press release saying that two branches of a huge Saudi charity called the IIRO, the International Islamic Relief Organization, one branch in the Philippines and the other branch in Indonesia, have been directly funding al-Qaeda. That's 2006. That's 5 years after 9/11. So there's introspection. You have self-critical articles appearing in Saudi-owned newspapers. There's Saudi military action internally against their own domestic al-Qaeda. But there's some features of the old Saudi system that remain. So what do we do with Saudi Arabia? Here's where avoiding a public embrace becomes very important. Maybe you can work quietly with Saudi Arabia, but you have to monitor their progress. If you have a big celebration with Saudi Arabia, you might get a lot of good newspaper coverage inside of Israel and maybe in some American newspapers as well. But you also might be adding legitimacy to a regime that hasn't yet finished its internal reform. And that would be a mistake. That would ease the pressure off them. And that would cause them perhaps to even go into a relapse in their behavior, which is why I'm an advocate of, let's call it diplomacy in the dark rather than diplomacy in the light in a case like Saudi Arabia. So when you have to evaluate whether you should, how to deal with these very complex situations, don't go into these public types of diplomatic initiatives which just may backfire on you down the road.
Well, this audience has been very patient, and now your patience will be rewarded because we have close on half an hour for questions. One warning, word of warning, or not so much warning, but request. When you ask your questions, there are two microphones on this side, that side. Please observe the old adage of being short, sharp, and concise. And that way we can get in more questions. We'll take 3 at a time and then ask our panelists to respond. I see somebody's ready over there.
I wanted to ask the question, what is the difference between Arab Shiism and Persian Shiism? And do you see a prospect of Iraqi Shiism, which is Arab Shiism, being dominated by Persian Shiism or vice versa?
I would have a word or two to say about this. Persian Shiism has now many centuries' experience of domination. Since the 16th century, Shiism has been the dominant form of Islam in Iran. And their whole psychological experience during that period has been one of being the dominant group, while non-Shiites were the subordinate groups. On the other hand, in the Arab world, it was the other way around. So Persian Shiites and Arab Shiites have an entirely different psychological background. I think that's the most important difference between them. Add to that they are one are Persians and the other are Arabs. And what was very striking during the long war between Iraq and Iran, the Shiites of Iran did not rally to their Persian brothers, just as the Arab minority in Iran did not rally to their Arab brothers.
Ari Rand.
I wonder whether the panel could comment on the statement just a few days ago by the Saudi king at the reconciliation summit in Kuwait that followed Doha, where even Mubarak and Assad supposed to have made up. And the Saudi king said that the Arab Peace Initiative is still on the table, but it will not be there for long. How should Israel respond? It has responded before the war in Gaza, and there were reports even today that the still Prime Minister Olmert, in a message to Obama, mentioned it.
I'd like to take a couple more questions.
Yes. I'd like to raise the question of the capacity of the West, and particularly Israel, to deter Iran by dealing with our immediate circle. That is Hamas and Hezbollah. That the existential hypothesis, that the existential for Israel is not the threat of Hamas and Hezbollah to our cities, whether north or south, but the fact that they are, if we want to deter Iran, we have to deal with Hamas and Hezbollah. And that is the existential question which we have failed at. Either we remove any possibility of an Iranian nuclear device, or we remove them from the Fertile Crescent.
Okay. One more question there.
I wanted to focus on Hasbara that Bernard Lewis was talking about. And one thing that's kind of bothered me, and I guess I was hoping the Israeli government would do with the American government, is create an Al Jazeera analog, but from the West's perspective, or Israel's perspective. Because Al Jazeera, even in English, looks kind of neutral, but it really isn't, if you really understand what's going on. And it's very frustrating to me, because it seemed to me, from what I heard from Bernard Lewis, the thing that's most powerful, the two comments I heard, was the hearing about democracy in Jordan and the 1 hour show in Iran. You know, so why we're spending $20 billion a year on military, $3 billion from America. How about $100 million of it to make an analog of Al Jazeera? Could we please do that? As speaking as an American.
I'd like to say something about deterring Iran. And I'll repeat what I say in every gathering which this issue comes up, and gives me the opportunity to say three things. One is that I think that we should all be a little more sane and a little more self-confident about Iran. I think we should all realize that Israel is indestructible. It's not possible to destroy Israel. It's possible to threaten Israel. It's possible to cause damage to Israel. But Israel is now a country with capabilities, the like of which you probably wish not to know, and I don't wish to impart to you. And I believe that in such a situation, we should be a little more sanguine in some of the things we're doing. And the second thing I'd like to say is that the Iranians, with all the capabilities they have, are not 10 foot tall. And let's remember that, talking about deterrence, in 2006, when their blood allies in Lebanon were attacked, they did nothing but rush around the world and ask for a quick ceasefire. And when we began the operation against Gaza within a week, they asked for a ceasefire and went all around the world seeking for it. And never forget what Henry Kissinger always says, that he who seeks a ceasefire has lost the war.
Right. Question about the Arab Peace Initiative, and since it's somewhat Saudi-related, I'll jump on that one. Look, the big issue with the Arab Peace Initiative is not the general desire to make peace. It's whether it's a take-it-or-leave-it proposal. Because the Arab Peace Initiative speaks about a full withdrawal to the 67 lines. It speaks about the right of return. It has a number of serious problems in it that have been analyzed by many of our best Middle East experts here. If they want us to come to the table, and they want to bring the Arab Peace Initiative, and we'll bring our initiative, that could be something that would be very interesting. In fact, we had the beginnings of negotiations with the Arab world at Madrid, and afterwards in the Moscow conference that launched the multilaterals back in 1991. So if we're smart, we'll learn how to take an initial step on their side, but don't turn it into a take it or leave it prospect, because that's something we can't take. But if we can leverage it into a negotiation, into a discussion, into something where we can institutionalize more regular diplomatic contact, that would be smart.
Okay.
Thank you. I'd like to ask the entire panel how the current Israeli-Palestinian situation fits into tonight's discussion. For example, in terms of the proposed two-state solution or the more recently proposed concept of confederation with Jordan and Egypt. How does everything that was said tonight impact on that, or vice versa?
Okay. Yes.
I would like to ask the panel what Israel actually achieved now in Gaza in terms of the relationship between Shiite and Sunni and the United States strategic thinking.
One more and then we'll...
We've been listening to a discussion on how Israel relates either to the Sunni world or the Shiite world. Since there are other powers in the world other than Israel, the USA, for instance, who is at the moment now our most powerful friend, other powers in the world, how do they relate to the Shiite versus Sunni divide? And do we have any flexibility? For instance, you had mentioned something about the U.S. pushing us in some tactical direction. The question is strategically, does the U.S. have a strategic interest in one of those sides as opposed to the other?
Bernard, do you think the U.S. has a strategic interest one way or the other on the Sunni-Shia divide?
Yes, U.S. obviously has a strategic interest. I'm still waiting for someone to define it.
Well, that's a very concise answer.
You know what it is. My question was because I would assume that Israel is not that powerful to buck all or some of the major powers, especially the U.S. The question is, does the U.S. have any interest, or whatever Israel wants, so let them do what they want?
Yeah, Dora. Oh, you would like to have another go there?
I think the point which we have to bear in mind is that for most of the governments of the Middle East, Israel is no longer what it has been for a long time, their principal problem. They have other problems which are more important, more urgent, and more dangerous. And their attitude to Israel, their policies towards Israel, will be determined by those other dangers and those other considerations. I think it's important to bear that in mind.
What about the United States?
What Israel thinks about the Shiite-Sunni divide is of importance beyond the considerations of Israel, because what happens in diplomacy is that you go to a London or you go to Washington and you're asked your opinion. And sometimes your analysis may actually be accepted by a much greater power. And therefore what you decide to do can be of tremendous importance. I mean, Ephraim was speaking about the Arms for Hostages affair back in 1985. It was Israel, according to public source material, that came to the Reagan administration and said, well, there are these potential moderates in Iran who we can fortify and strengthen. And the National Security Council, against the advice of the State Department and Defense Department, said, yeah, let's try it. Let's do it together. So sometimes if you have a concept, your reading of the situation in Iran, your understanding of what's going on in Syria is very important. Now, the other just two other comments. One, where does the U.S. stand on this whole Shiite-Sunni divide? For many, many years, the U.S. has stood where Saudi Arabia wants it to stand.
As on many things.
As on many things. But it was Saudi Arabia, and people talk about Israeli influence in Washington, you know, the two academics, Walton Mersheimer. I mean, Saudi Arabia is preponderant for a variety of reasons that go beyond this discussion tonight. The other question is how the Russians view the Sunni-Shiite conflict, because the Russians are acting in a very curious way. If you ask the Russians about this question, they'll say, well, in Chechnya we're facing a Sunni insurgency. So and they'll always be upset at Saudi Arabia, which they say is supporting this insurgency and servicing the American interest against them. But they have no problem then wedding up with Shiite Iran, to whom they've been giving missile technology, nuclear technology, and advanced weaponry. So they're obviously putting their chips on the Shiite side of this, thinking there's no blowback to Central Asia if they do it. I'm not sure they're right. I think they're going to have a bad surprise if Iran gets stronger.
Ephraim, a question was raised here about what actually did Israel benefit from or gain from this war in Gaza, and what is the impact on the Palestinian question of this whole wider discussion that we've been having this evening?
I think given the late hour, it's not possible to develop a very detailed analysis on this, and we're not being offered breakfast, I believe.
Unfortunately. Yes. Yes, sure.
Here I'm providing a question.
Yes.
Here I'm adding to the question, not providing an answer. What did Israel gain? Is the question. And I would ask, how much of that gain, whatever it was, has already been squandered?
Well, I'd like to say that there are three elements that Israel has gained up to now in the war against Gaza. First of all, I think that the immediate threat which was there has been removed. For how long, I don't know, but it's been removed. Secondly, I believe that Iran has suffered a very severe setback because, once again, it's been exposed as being ineffective and incapable of doing anything to come to the support of its allies or its proxies in given situations of actual combat. And thirdly, I believe that what has been gained is that the countries now being led by Egypt, for the first time probably ever, have the opportunity to mount something very effective in terms of trying to stabilize a situation and have within the Palestinian camp an effective leverage on both sides within the Palestinian camp, I don't know whether in the end this will work or not. I think it's too early to say. But my view is, and I know that this is not a view shared by everybody, that ultimately for the Palestinians to be able to do something credible and useful, they will have to reach a point in which they will unite around a more moderate stand. When I say unite, I mean to say that all major factions will unite. I think this is not impossible. It's not impossible. And I'd like to draw your attention to a statement made this afternoon by Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister of Britain, who made a very, very strange statement in my view, and he said that the key issue now is who will unite around a two-state solution. He didn't talk about terms, about conditions. All of those who will unite around a two-state solution will be eligible to become partners in a coalition of sorts on the Palestinian side. For the last 18 months, leading Hamas people have been saying that in the given circumstances, they will accept a Palestinian state in what they call provisional borders of the 1967. Provisional borders. And they know, and this has been said in private, that this is a point of departure. They know that the 1967 borders per se will not be the final borders, the final provisional borders between Israel and the Palestinian state. I'm not saying that this is the redemption. I'm not saying that we can believe that the Messiah is here tomorrow morning. No. But things are happening, and we should listen to what people say. In my profession over 40 years, the most important thing I learned and the most important thing I practiced was not what I said, but what I listened to. And I certainly commend to you that the proportion between talking and listening should be 80-20.
Very good.
It's good to know that that's what they teach you in the Mossad. Yes, short, sharp, and concise.
I'd like to ask the esteemed panel if you could comment on a remark that was made when he was Secretary of State General Alexander Haig, that the United States can rest assured and feel a lot of comfort in the fact that in the Middle East there is the largest land-based aircraft carrier that's looking after her interests, of course referring to Israel. To what extent do the European Union and the United States believe in those words of Alexander Haig? And also, Egypt, which is of course a friend of ours, so to speak, or has a peace relations, is considered by some to be the major center of the dissemination of anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, anti-Israeli propaganda. What can Israel do in that respect? And just one other small thing.
Okay. That's fine. That's two.
Okay.
Two is enough. Next.
What are the implications of your analysis tonight on how should Israel approach the Arab League or the so-called Saudi claim?
Okay, one more question.
I was hoping to ask the panel, I understand that, fundamentally the Sunni-Shia collaboration is oil on water, but I was hoping that you'd be able to expound upon when do the forces of Shiism and Sunnism, when do they converge? Jim Woolsey and others have said that they often converge in tactical measures when they're anti-Western. Can you think of other areas when they would converge, and whether even anti-Semitism is a source for the confluence of these two forces?
Well, I would certainly say yes. But, Bernard, would you like to...
I take the first one.
Yeah.
Israel is an aircraft carrier. That is a statement which dates from the time of the Cold War, when there was a global confrontation between two rival superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, and the Middle East was an extremely important area where the two met in conflict, and the role of Israel was consequently important. That has ended. The Soviet Union has disappeared. No replacement has as yet emerged. The global conflict has ended. And with the end of that, and with the end of its great adversary, the nature of the United States' interest in the Middle East has also changed. I think we may say by now that both of the competing superpowers have either withdrawn or are in the process of withdrawal from the region. I think the perception of Israel as an aircraft carrier is now outdated. Thank you.
A point was raised about, for the first time this evening, in passing, about the European Union in all of this. Do you think there is anything to be said about that?
As a former Israel ambassador to the European Union, I'd like to assure you all that you can rest assured that nothing the European Union will do will ultimately affect the future and the defense and interests of Israel. And I believe that apart from their desire, as they say always, they don't want to be only payers but also players. I believe that yes, they would like to be players, and I'd like to just tell you one very quick story. When I became ambassador to the European Union, I made a quick round with all the officials there, and I came to the offices of the Council of Ministers and met the Senior Director General there. At the end of the meeting, I asked, could I have his telephone numbers? And he said, well, you have my office numbers. I said, no, I need your telephone numbers, your mobiles and so forth. He said, why? I said, well, something can happen. He said, well, you can call the office. I said, well, what will happen if something happens over the weekend? He says, in Europe, nothing happens over the weekend.
When tactically Sunnis and Shias decide to converge in anti-Western interests, and why?
Well, there have been actually remarkable cases of cooperation. After the Gulf War back in 1991, the head of the Sudan, Hassan Tourebi, had a conference, a succession of conferences, one in 91 and one in 93, of opponents of the United States and the West, and attending were a gallery of such individuals as Osama bin Laden, Yasser Arafat in the first meeting, members from Hamas, from Hezbollah, and the Iranians, of course, were building a presence in Sudan at the time. So you saw an ability of Iran to cooperate with Sunni groups and with, of course, their Shiite Hezbollah. The more remarkable cases are right after the American invasion of Afghanistan after 9/11, because many of the al-Qaeda who were based in Afghanistan sought refuge someplace else, and many of them went to Iran and located themselves there, including Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who became known as the killer of Shiites. So here was a Sunni extremist, Zarqawi, Jordanian in origin, receiving assistance from Iran, actually living in Iran for a period of time, and then joining the jihad in Iraq, first in Kurdistan and then elsewhere, and killing Shiites. So I guess that what's common in the first case in Sudan and the second case with Zarqawi in Iran is that antipathy to the West that allows them to overcome their differences and work together in tactical cooperation.
Yeah.
This question is primarily for Professor Lewis, because I address his books. If I recall correctly, then in the books I have read, the main gap, the main dichotomy was between the nationalist movements and the religious movements. Now, does the rise of the Sunni-Shia conflict means this conflict is the nationalist religious conflict is no longer that important, or is it replaced by it, or how does it affect it? And it's important to Israel because, of course, it seems that we can somehow live and deter the nationalist movements, while the religious movement cannot be deterred, or harder to be deterred by power.
In the Arab world, national and religious identity overlap and often even coincide. The whole idea of national identity is a modern one and an importation from Europe. If you look at the map of the Arab world, almost all the names of the states are modern creations, and some of them don't even exist in Arabic. There's no word in Arabic for Algeria or for Tunisia. You use the name of the city, that's also for the name of the country. This is an imported idea of recent and alien origin. And if one looks at what people really say and really mean, the religious element is there, it's important, it's even dominant. But in talking of Iran, I think we have to bear in mind an important difference. Iran, unlike most of the other countries in the Middle East and North Africa, is a real nation country, as we use that term in the Western world. And in Iran you have something which you don't have elsewhere. You have patriotism, as distinct from nationalism. In Iran, there is a genuine patriotic sentiment in the sense in which that word is used in the Western world. And I mention this because I think it's particularly important for us not to say or do things which would antagonize that Iranian patriotic sentiment. For the moment, I think it's more on our side than against us.
You know, Bernard, the first part of what you just said was exactly the point of view of the Ayatollah Khomeini. This was his argument. And about the country which, as you pointed out, really has an ancient civilization and a strong sense of national identity. So it is even more extraordinary in a way what happened in Iran. Next.
Yes, I would like to know if you could elaborate a little more on how Shiite Iran has managed to influence Hamas so much, and how much this is related to an absence of Saudi Arabian influence over Hamas as a result of American pressures since 2003, as you mentioned before, Mr. Gold.
We'll take the last question as well.
It's actually related. Does the Sunni-Shiite conflict come in between the terrorist groups themselves? I mean, will Al-Qaeda be more sympathetic to Hamas, for example, as a Sunni or Wahhabian group, as opposed to Hezbollah or other radical Shiite groups?
On the second question, I don't think there's a single answer. It depends on each time, each place, each incident, and the answer will vary considerably. As regards the earlier question on identity, yes, that is certainly important, and it remains an important, even a dominant element.
Dora?
Yeah. On Hamas and Iran and the Iranian influence on Hamas, I think it's interesting to look at the larger movement, which is the Muslim Brotherhood. You know, back in the early 1980s, when Hafiz al-Assad had a strategic alliance with Ayatollah Khomeini, but decimated the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria in large massacres, the Iranians didn't lift a finger to criticize Hafiz al-Assad's action. So the Iranians didn't really care for what happened to the Muslim Brotherhood. We saw a very important change in 2006 because the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt came out in support of Hezbollah and Hassan Nasrallah, which was a big shift. By the way, the Wahhabi clerics in Saudi Arabia were coming out against Hezbollah, so you had a division there. Look, the Hamas are not puppets of Iran, but over time, if you're getting money from Iran, if you're getting military equipment from Iran, and if Hamas operatives leave through the tunnels on the Philadelphia route and fly to Tehran for training with the Revolutionary Guards, all that has to have a net impact of some kind of loyalty that's developed. Now, Fatah exploited that, and I remember at some point after the 2006 elections in the Gaza Strip, Fatah demonstrators calling Hamas Shiites. They're not Shiites.
And they didn't mean that as a compliment.
Yes, but they are not puppets, but they are under they're incredibly dependent, and they're under influence, and that influence has only grown.
On the evening of the Annapolis conference in 2006, the question arose, where would Syria be? And Syria initially decided not to go to Annapolis and was going to organize an anti-Annapolis conference in Damascus. At the very last minute, the Syrians decided to go to Annapolis, and they were present there. And I don't want to go into the questions why they did this or not. That's not the point. And suddenly, the anti-Annapolis initiative was seeking a venue. And the Iranians stepped in and said, let's have the anti-Annapolis conference in Tehran. And Hamas refused to go there. They refused to attend the anti-Annapolis conference in Tehran. Now, I'm not saying that this is the greatest thing on earth. What I'm saying is that it's very dangerous in our terms to simplify things. I agree with everything that Dora has said, except for one point. In the ultimate, the Hamas are their own masters, and they can be their own masters, and now that they've fought this war against Israel alone, without Iranian support throughout the battle. Yes, they got all the training and all the equipment before, but when fighting began, the Iranians were sitting in the balcony like all the rest. And they will not forget this. And there's a lot of bitterness about this. And there's a lot of things that Israel can do as a result of this if it acts in a sophisticated way, in a clever way, which I'm sure the Jewish genius will do, as in all times.
Once more, I would like to thank Professor Bernard Lewis, Ambassador Dora Gold, and Ephraim Alevi.